We have the idea of a partnership. We have the idea of constitutions, of rules. We have the idea of safeguarding the community. That leads naturally to the idea then that good citizenship, the excellence of citizenship, is found in what we might call common interest, the ability to recognize the common interest of the state. Governments which have regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice and therefore are true forms. That governments which have regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice and therefore are true forms. So the idea is partnership, rules, safeguarding the community ultimately leads to this notion of a common interest, that we see ourselves as connected to the state. In this context, in this discussion of citizenship, we are able to adduce a set of principles which then help us guide our thinking in terms of what kind of political community we wish to structure. Now, it is important and sometimes confusing to students to realize that when he talks about true forms of government, that doesn't necessarily mean enshrining in government principles of equality that we would recognize ourselves as just. For instance, is oligarchy a true form of government according to Aristotle? Those of you who read the text, you will know the answer is yes. Because an oligarchy can operate according to a set of rules. It can be constitutional, so therefore it is a true form of government. Is it necessarily the best? Not necessarily. But it is constituted in this way. It safeguards the community, it is a partnership of citizens, it is rule-bound, and so therefore it is a true form of government. Can a tyranny be a true form of government? No. A tyranny is excluded then from that consideration because it is simply the rule of one person without regard to others. In fact, later in the text, he compares a tyranny to that of the master-slave relationship. One of the key elements then in the context of this excellence of the citizen, the ability of politics to nurture in you this understanding that you are in partnership with others, that you are there to safeguard the community, that you are bound by a set of rules, that you are there to serve the common interest. A key element of that is to recognize the way in which power gets distributed inside the state. And one of the things that he says at 1277a and b is it is important for us to recognize equally not only the capacity to rule, but an equally important capacity of citizenship is the art of being ruled over. So it's not just ruling other people, but the art of being ruled over. Both of those have their own excellence. Both of those have their own characteristics. He says, it is sometimes thought that the ruler and the ruled must learn different things and not the same, but that the citizen must know and share in them both. The inference is obvious. It's not just that we need to learn one. We need to learn both how to be ruled as well as to rule. This is important for the ruler, right? For somebody who attains a position of power, because the understanding of what it means to be governed by a force above you is critical if we wish to erect what kind of government. Someone who doesn't believe that there's anything constraining what they do, that we would call tyranny. But if there is something that's constraining what we do, what do we call that? Where do we enshrine rules that are above all men? In a constitution. So the principle of constitutionalism, if you are interested in formulating or constructing a government that's based on a constitutional principle, you therefore must inculcate in all citizens not only the art of ruling, how to command, how to lead, but also the art of being ruled. For he who rules must always nonetheless be governed by these constitutional principles. He says at 1277b, he said, there is rule of another kind which is exercised over free men and equals by birth. It is a constitutional rule, which the ruler must learn by obeying, as he would learn the duties of a general of cavalry by being under the orders of a general of cavalry, or the duties of a general of infantry, etc. Right? It has been well said that he who has never learned to obey cannot be a good commander. If you've never learned to obey, you cannot ask others to obey you. And so enshrined then, as part of this idea of the state, is that in order for us to attain constitutional rule, constitutional order, we might say, inside the state, we must inculcate inside the citizen, or the state must be constituted in such a way so as to grant the citizen the understanding both how to exercise power and how to have power exercised over them. That is part then of the arete, the excellence of the citizenship. What then is a constitution? A set of rules we have defined it. Can we say it? Can we define it a little bit further? And indeed we can, because Aristotle helps explain what he means by this constitutionalism. So let's take a look at it a little bit. He says, for example, preliminarily at 1278b, lines 9, 10, and 11, a constitution is the arrangement of magistracies in a state, especially of the highest of all. What is a magistracy? Who is the magistrate? What do? They adjudicate law. So the Constitution is found in the law-giving institutions of the state, or the law-adjudicating institutions of the state, and the most important, therefore, the highest of all. Today we would call that, what do you call it here in Spain? You have your, well, don't you call it the Tribunal? You have the Tribunal Constitucional. That would be the one. The one that essentially defines the boundaries between what is legal and what is illegal, or what is just and what is unjust, at the highest possible level. He said, not only that, a constitution is the arrangement of magistrates, but he says, the government is everywhere sovereign in the state, and the constitution is, in fact, the government. That is what rules over you, is the constitution. Not a person, but a set of agreed upon laws. That's the nature of the partnership. The partnership of the citizen is actually the citizen with the constitution. That's where the partnership is found. Who does that remind you of? That idea. Where have we seen that before? That you are bound by a form of partnership or contract with the rules that govern you. Socrates in the Crito, right? It's a restatement of that basic Socratic principle. And note the idea that's there, that the Constitution should be found everywhere in the state, that the state needs to be governed at all times by its rules. We can see further he refines this by explaining it in the context of the terms of the household that he'd gone into in Book 1. This nature of the partnership or relationship between the individual, the citizen, and the Constitution is not, as he says, like that of a slave to a master. So it's not as if we are enslaved to the Constitution. Remember, what was it that defines the master-slave relationship? It is the unilateral distribution of logos, and the master acts over the slave in whose interest? In his own interest, because remember, he describes the slave as the body of the master. If the slave happens to benefit from the orders of the master, that's fine. But that's not why the master orders the slave to do as he does. As he says, the slave acts solely to the interest of the master. So a master-slave relationship is defined one where you're acting purely in your own self-interest. Is that consistent with Aristotle's view of the state? No, it is not. What is the relationship in the household which is for the larger household good, the common good? It is the relationship between husband and wife, exactly. On the other hand, the government of a wife and children and a household, which we have called household management, is exercised in the first instance for the good of the governed or for the common good of all parties. So in a sense, if we extrapolate from that household relationship, woman, silence, what is it? Silence is a woman's glory. We now then recast that in constitutional terms. We now are under the state, under the constitution of the state in much the same way. Our job is not to be constantly talking back, to be criticizing, to be objecting, and so on. Our job is to recognize that the Constitution is there. We have our own logos, we have our capacity for persuasive speech, but we are subordinated to the rules of the society in which we live. And this is necessarily the case. That should remind you of something we looked back at last class, in which Aristotle admonishes us. He talks about bad practices in the state. We ended the class with. Did you remember something he said about bad practices in the state? What should states not do? Constantly be changing their laws. Constantly changing their laws is an example of bad constitutional rule. Why? Because it suggests a lack of respect for the laws under which you live, and if you don't happen to like it, you should be constantly complaining and sort of objecting to what they are. States should not accept that, because the Constitution exercises this authority over us in a way that is not equal but unequal. It's worth noting, by the way, that in that context of citizenship, he says, as part of this sort of rule-bound society, who gets to be the state, right? Is everybody who lives in a society a citizen? Slaves are not citizens. But he has another distinction for citizenship. Who else doesn't get to be a citizen? Do you remember? He defines a citizen as those who share in the honors of the state. Those who share in the honors of the state. What is an honor that the state can confer? And I think in this sense, it's the ability both to be ruled and to rule over. So the definition of citizenship for Aristotle is defined around the question of participation. Who gets to participate in the state? And as a result, he allows for essentially what we would look at today as a property rights, a property ownership distinction that defines who gets to be a citizen. A slave is not a citizen. A slave is in fact the property of somebody else. He is merely a good. But he also notes that what he calls the mechanics, the people who make things, the lower classes, also can be excluded from citizenship. They don't have enough property. They're not important enough properly to be considered part of the state. And so he has a kind of classist view of who should be part of the state in the sense of who should be granted citizenship. And he points out, I mentioned it as property because that's the most common thing, although it's not necessarily property, because he says you don't actually have to be rich. It's more a question of whether you share in these basic values, right? This question of acting for the common good, recognizing the partnership, being willing to be bound by the rules, and so on. This is the nature of what is the good citizen in the state. So it's not, for example, a kind of radical argument in favor of mass democratic participation and freedom. He could not be clearer that that is not the case. And so at the very end of this discussion, this question of who we are as citizens, the nature of our citizenship, the question of what constitutions are, how they function, the nature of justice that they provide, and so on, these kind of preliminary terms about thinking about what kind of government we want, he comes to this conclusion at 1279a, lines 15 and following. He says, the conclusion is evident that governments which have a regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice and are therefore true forms, as I read before. So in other words, as a result of this inquiry, we can define between false forms of government and true forms of government. What does that mean? Why is that important? False forms of government, like a tyranny, it's not worth trying to improve the politics because they're not real political systems. Only true forms of government can you exercise your skill of politics in order to improve them. So we can reject, for example, tyranny. You can't make a tyranny into a better kind of government. It can't create a better kind of citizen. It's not a true form of government. Only those governments which can exist under some kind of constitutional authority. And the three that he mentions are kingship, aristocracy, or oligarchy, and democracy, which he then comes to in Book 4. I want to jump ahead a little bit to Book 4 to consider this question of constitutionalism again, to set up then the last part of our discussion today, which we'll then pick up again next time. At section 1290a, lines 8 following, he says, again, if we recall that he says a constitution are the magistracies, he notes further, he says, a constitution is an organization of offices which all the citizens distribute amongst themselves according to the power which different classes possess. For example, the rich or the poor, or according to some principle of equality which includes both. There must therefore be as many forms of government as there are modes of arranging the offices according to the superiorities and the differences of the parts of the state. So if we establish this idea that true government means a government that can be expressed constitutionally, meaning government that can be captured according to a set of overarching rules, that doesn't mean that there is only one form of constitutional government. It means, therefore, that there are as many forms of constitutional government as there are ways of distributing power, people, through the offices that constitutional government itself creates. And effectively, he recognizes three, or really actually only two. One is a government of the rich, in which office holding and power is held by people who are wealthy. And the other is a government of the many, in which they are distributed simply based on the multitude of people. And from this we get these sort of two fundamental forms of government. Government by the rich, or by it's not the rich, we should call it the elite, is oligarchy. And government of the many is, from the word for people, demos, democracy. Having gone through this inquiry in Book 3, the conclusion that we can come to is, if you accept his definition of the citizen and citizenship, and if you further accept the idea that there is a link between citizenship and logos, thereby necessitating the use of constitutional means to order the society in political ways, that therefore we are only really two forms of government that we need to think about. And he has a long excursus on kingship, which we're not going to bother getting into this class. Government by the elite or government by the many. And so the question that then occupies Aristotle going forward is, which of these two is better? Oligarchy or democracy? And as he points out in a kind of lengthy discussion, you can actually attach qualities to both. For example, you might want to refer to large numbers of people with reference to, say, opinions about good theater or music. The opinions of many people might be helpful in those circumstances. On the other hand, You would not want to have lots of people perform knee surgery on you. You'd want to find one person who knew what they were doing and have that person do it and do it well. There are moments when it's valuable for us to capture the skills of the many, and there are moments when it is best to capture the skills of only a few. Which means that both oligarchy and democracy have features which can be considered advantageous. So when we think about the true form of government, we can't proceed from some basic principle about which is just and which is unjust. It's not going to work in that way. We today enshrine our political principles based on essentially readings of like human rights, or rights that are granted by the Constitution to all citizens based on equality of opportunity and participation. For Aristotle, it's not that obvious. Should somebody who has no education, no interest in the affairs of state, and doesn't care one way or the other about the political life of their country, should that person receive the same political participatory power as somebody who has studied politics and is well versed in the questions of the day? For Aristotle, that's pretty clear. Why would you want somebody who is ignorant and uninterested having the same decision-making power as somebody who is educated and motivated? And a system that distributes equal rights to both of those is a system that for Aristotle is inherently flawed. What system do we call that? Democracy. What system do we live under? Democracy. So we live under a system that Aristotle considers to be deeply flawed. Aristotle would say, if you live under a democracy, you'll see people making stupid decisions. They'll do things like, I don't know, decide to leave the European Union because you don't like people who have a different color skin than you do, for instance. Or you might decide to elect some reality TV star because you think his gold toilet is really cool, or something like this. Once you invest power in the hands of the demos, of the mass, you run into this problem. How much can you actually trust their ability to be good citizens? And the thing is, if you then erect a government based on those principles, you have a problem because, as we noted, the formal cause of the state, what a state looks like, is created by what? The nature of the government that it has. So if you have a bad system of distributing power, which leads to bad government, what do you end up with? Bad citizenship. Which then may lead to an unjust circumstance. Good people whose excellence or virtue as a person is not able to be realized in the terms or the form of their citizenship. And if you roll that along, you can then get to the final question, which is, does that make human flourishing, eudaimonia, more likely or less likely? Answer, less likely. So therefore, if we want to try and optimize this variable, how do we get to the best possible form of the state in order to then optimize people's ability to flourish within it? We have to be able to think about how we can modulate these two extremes, the rule of elites versus the rule of the many, in a way that best serves the underlying purpose of government, which is to achieve eudaimonia, right? As he says at the beginning, it is the highest good of all. We know already, we've advanced our argument a little bit, because we know that whatever it is, that it must take place under a form of constitutionalism. In fact, it must do more than that. It must place a constitutional authority at the very center of the state, and it must suffuse the state with that constitutionalism to the point where the Constitution is the government, as he says in Book 3. So the question then is, who gets to decide, how do we create the partnership that ultimately decides or creates what that Constitution will look like? How do we construct a form of government that can build up a constitutional system which allows us to achieve eudaimonia? Well, if you have an extreme on this side and you have an extreme on this side and you can identify flaws with both, what do you think the answer is? How do you solve the problem? What do you look for? Some solution where?
In the middle.
In the middle. And that is, in fact, exactly what Aristotle dedicates books 4 and particularly book 5 to constructing. He makes a normative argument. In other words, this is the politics that we should practice. We would call it today politics of the middle class. I think we would call it today. But he calls it a middle form of government. A government that is not simply of the elites, that is not simply of the great mass of people, but by some kind of sober and responsible middle. The best state, as Aristotle suggests to us, is the state that is ruled then from the middle. It is a state whose constitutionalism reflects that of the middle, whose ruling class is drawn from the people in the middle, and that excludes those who are either at the bottom or at the top. And I'd like to read to you one little passage which I think captures this idea. In all states, there are three elements. See if this sounds right to you. One class is very rich. One class is very poor. Agreed? And one is in the mean, or the middle. It is admitted that moderation and the mean are best, and therefore it will clearly be best to possess the gifts of fortune in moderation. For in that condition of life, men are most ready to follow rational principle. Think about it. If you're born very rich, it's easy to command others, but it's hard to obey, and vice versa. And indeed, that's the very next point he says. He says, the evil begins at home. Another way of saying the word home is what? Household. What was the beginning of the book? The politics of the household. So the politics of the middle reflects the politics of the household. The evil begins at home. When they are boys, by reason of the wealth in which they are brought up, they never learn, even at school, how to obey. As he says, the habit of obedience. They are only used to ordering other people about. On the other hand, the very poor, who are in the opposite extreme, are too degraded, so that one class cannot obey and can only rule despotically, and the other knows not how to command and must be ruled like slaves. Thus arises a city not of free men, but of masters and slaves, the one despising, the other envying, and nothing can be more fatal to friendship and good fellowship in states than this. And remember, what did we note last time? What is one of the key elements of a state? Its capacity to create friendship among its constituent elements. Therefore, if rule by the wealthy creates despotism, and the people who are at the bottom don't have the capacity to rule, creating chaos, and we have one of these systems creating a master-slave relationship, we have not honored our underlying constitutional aim. Therefore, what is the solution? Rule by the middle. And so Aristotle's normative politics, what he says is the best kind of politics, not necessarily the politics that we need to practice in our own societies, because he says all of our politics is circumstantial. But if we're asking what is the best kind of politics, that politics is a politics of the middle. How do you know you have the best kind of politics? The best kind of politics is a politics where the good man is also, definitionally, the good citizen. A state that is ruled according to a covenant where the good man and the good citizen are the same, that is the best state. When we come back next week, we will then consider in some detail how he constructs an argument for that. Have a great weekend. I will see you again on Monday.